Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Naveen and today's video is about the course called Practice with REFramework. So first, first we will see how we access this course. So you have to first log into your UIPath Academy account and go to courses and search for RE framework, and this will display the RE framework related modules, and then click on the course called Practice with REFramework. So the reason I or anybody should do this course is because, as it's mentioned here, to get familiar with the REFramework template. So the exercises in this course helps you to become kind of an expert in REFramework. So before we go and try to understand the expectations of this course, I would like to uh, recommend everybody to first try the basics of RE framework, like how does the dispatcher work, how does the performer work, some kind of hands-on before they try this exercise. So there are lots of YouTube videos that you can refer, uh, that's related to the dispatches and performer. Try something simple, and once you get comfortable, then you should try to practice this exercise. Okay, so let's move on to what are the expectations of this exercise. So they have a process design document, they also have hints, and there is a place, excuse me, where you can upload the assignment. So I have downloaded this process design document. So let's check it out. Okay, so this is the process design document, and I won't be going through the entire document. Rather, we can go directly to the requirement. So let's go to the assess process description. So what do they actually expect from you to do here? So they want you to calculate the client security hash based on the client information, basically. So, and how do you do that? So let's go to the step-by-step process. So first they expect you to log in into the application known as Acme application. Okay, so this is much better. It has got screenshots. So let's follow this one. So, and it's bigger as well. Font is bigger. So first step is open the Acme System 1 web application. So some of you might be familiar with the Acme website, some of you not. So let me open that for everybody's benefit. Okay, so you go into the website, and let's say you are a first time user. You click on register, provide your email ID, password, and register yourself. Just like any other website, but please note that use the same email ID and password that you use to log in with your UiPath account, because uh, for evaluation purposes, the the bot that actually grades you for this exercise would use the same email account, and I mean the email and password credentials. Okay, so let's say that you have created a login and you log in into your account. So I'm just doing the login here. So the next expectation is to go to the dashboard and check whether the dashboard is appearing correctly. After that, you have to click on the work items. All right. So what we see here is a number of work items or different statuses. So some of them status is open, some of them is completed. So this is actually my data that I use to complete this exercise. So if you want to have a fresh data, that's like if when you are first time user, you would not have anything in the work items. So you go to user options and click on reset test data. So what that would do is it will create new bunch of work items for you. So for this, for the purpose of this video, I'm not clicking that one because we have to go and discuss what we are doing next. So once we have clicked on the work items, one second please. Yeah. Okay, so what do we do next? Okay, for each activity of type WI5. So what is this? Let's see. What is WI5? It's the activity known as calculate client security hash. So basically they want us to go to each activity of type WI5 and extract these parameters, that is the client information, client ID, client name, and client country. So let me show that to you what the expectation is. Yeah, so it mentions open the details page of the activity to retrieve the client details. Right. Now once you have retrieved this information, next step is to provide an input to a SHA1 generated web page. So for my purposes, I have used the sha1online.com, this particular website. So what I should do is, as per the instructions, I should copy each item here. There I copy the second one, and excuse me. Next I have copied the client, and I have to click on hash. Okay, and now I have to copy this result and go back to my Acme website, click on update work item, paste that here. I'm sorry, let me do that again. Okay, paste this here, click on completed, update work item, click on update work item, press OK, close it. So what would happen is the status which is initially open would now show completed at the end of this process. So then after this, after you completed one work item, you go back and you start processing every other work item. So once you're done with this particular page, go to the next one and identify the next work item of type WI5, go to the web page and extract the elements and find the hash and update the work item and update the status to completed. So you keep on doing this until you complete the entire work item of type WI5. So this is basically the expectations. Here, let me show you that what I have been explaining. Set the status to completed, add a comment with the security hash, and continue with the next W5, I'm sorry, WI5 activity. Okay, so let's also see what they have mentioned about the error scenarios. What are the kind of expectations? So one possible scenario they want us to handle is that this website, that is the Acme UiPath website itself, is not available. So you have to throw the exception once if that happens. Another is the the user enters incorrect email or password. You have to capture that and throw an exception. And one more is, let's say there are no work items of type WI5. Excuse me. So in that scenario as well, you have to calculate client security hash if this is not available. In that scenario, they expect us to handle that exception. Now, I'm sure that there'll be a couple of scenarios that are not mentioned here, and you will encounter it. So I would recommend to cover to the best extent possible. So that's it for the uh, expectations for this exercise. Now let's move on to how we can implement this using our UiPath Studio. Okay, so I have already opened our UiPath Community Edition, and how you would create an RE framework project is by clicking on what you see over here, the Robotic Enterprise Framework project, and give the name of your project, your location, the type of language you want, and click create, and it will create a brand new RE framework built for you. So I already have the project that I'm going to be going through right now for the explanation. So uh, before we proceed on to uh, how to go about this exercise, let's just have a quick review of RE framework. So basically, the RE framework consists of different states like initialization states, get transaction data, process transaction, and end process. And uh, the states can transition between one another depending on the status. So, for example, in the initialization status state, it will uh, it can either go to the get transaction data state if the transaction status is successful. So, or it can go to the system exception state if there's an exception. So we know that in the initialization state, the we are using it to add queue items uh, to our queue, and then in the transaction data state, our each transaction item is being read, and here the bottom, the process transaction state, we are processing each and every transaction one by one that we are fetching from the queue. Now, what you see here are three statuses. So let's say uh, the transaction that's being processed is successful. We go and fetch the next transaction data. If it's a business exception, like for example, let's say for some reason, so let's say the system is not down, but it's like a business rule that's not being satisfied, then again the transaction is marked as failed, and we go and get the next transaction. However, you see if there's a system exception, it goes back to the initialization state. Right. So that's it about the RE framework in short. And another thing I wanted you guys to note is something that's over here. So what you see here is all the folders in your orchestra. So here, if you check, this is my current folder. So this exercise, we are going to use queues to add our work items, and I have already created a queue for this. So that's my service name. So this is my folder that I am using. Note that this folder name is matching over here, and I created so many queues here. So you can create any queue by clicking on add queue, and a queue will be created. And this queue, you have to give the name in the data folder. So go to data, click on config. Right. So here, if you check it out, this is the name of the queue. This is the variable called orchestrator queue name, and that's the value for that. So this is queue name that I created in my orchestra. And this is the queue folder. So this is not mandatory, but I just put it there. Right. And apart from that, I have also um, mentioned here the Acme URL and the SHA URL. So I didn't want to hard code it. So I have externalized it in the Excel sheet. Okay. So next, what we are going to do is we are going to first, in our initialization phase, we are going to read each and every work item one by one and filter uh, filter and keep only the work items that have type WI5, and add this into the queue. So let's see how we go about it. So let me increase the, that's kind of not all right. So I'm going to open the initialization phase, and you might know that in the initialization phase, all the settings and the constants or the assets that you can find in the config sheet. So you have three tabs here, right? Settings and constants and assets. So these values are being read in the initialization phase, and they have the workflow for that. So the workflow for that is init all settings.xml, and this XML file, I'm sorry, SAML file, here it will read all the config sheets that you just read, just I mentioned, and the data will be populated in a dictionary. And if you check the arguments of this workflow, so the input file is the config file, and it reads the sheets. Here is settings and constants, like we mentioned, and output is a dictionary with a key and value, key and object value. Right. So once that is done, that's the framework takes care of that. Next, there is another workflow, an important workflow here, where we initialize all our applications that we want at the beginning, so before the processing of the transaction starts. So let's go and check what we can do here. Right. So what we are doing here is, in the beginning we are checking uh, whether there are any items in the queue, and we are keeping that variable in a location. So the variable name is work item queue, and we will be using that variable later. So initially we know that there are no items in the queue, so we just store the value. So the queue item count will be 0. Next, we are splitting the workflow into a couple of parts. Like, so first, a workflow is login workflow. So what we are doing here is we are getting the credentials from the asset, orchestrator asset, and logging in. So let me show you that this is basically straightforward. So right. So so like I mentioned in the config sheet, I have I have externalized the URL. So this activity called use browser will open the Acme UiPath application, and we are initially checking the state of the website, whether it is having the login element, UID element, and if the login element is present, we get the UI. Um, I'm sorry, we get the credentials, basically my username and password for the Acme UiPath. So you will be familiar with how to create an asset in Orchestrator. If not, I will show you. So what you can do is you can go to add asset, create a new asset, give the asset name, whatever you want it to be. And then when you click on credential, you can give the username and password. So already I have created a credential named as Acme underscore cred, and that credential I'll be using to log in into my website. So here I have basically it's very straightforward. I type into email, I type into password and log in. Right. Now let's go on to the next workflow, which is the dashboard. So let me just log in. Right. So in the dashboard workflow, it again checks whether the UI element called dashboard is present. and if that is present, it clicks on the work items. So it's basically very straightforward. And if suppose for some reasons the credentials are wrong, then as per expectations, it will throw an error message saying incorrect username or password. So we have to create a new business rule exception for that, and that will create, I'm sorry, that will throw a business rule exception, and which again end up in a system exception. So that's for the dashboard. And yes, one more thing. So if you check the selector for this particular browser, so if you see the selector, I have put an asterisk here or a wildcard because if you notice this website, the the title of the website, every page is Acme System 1 hyphen something. So the until System 1, everything is constant. Let me show you. So I click on work items. So if you see here, until System 1, everything is constant. After that, it changes. So I, I just didn't want to take a chance. So I put a wildcard there, right? So that's that explains it. Next, so once we are on the dashboard page, next we click the work items, and you can see here the work items are getting displayed here. And now I'm going to the next workflow. Yeah, so here I'm checking whether for some reason the queue already has the work items, then I do not add those queue items again. But for the first time, in the first run, there will be no queue items, right? So in that case, I go to a new workflow called as extract work item. Right. So in the extract work item, I check the app state first, like whether it has this UI element called as work items. And if that's there, and if you guys have some, if you people have used table extraction, so this is extract table data. It's basically just extracts this table by data scraping one by one, and you mention what's the next symbol to be used, and it just extracts every data over here. So it's as straightforward as that. That's what this is done. I store the data that I extracted from the table into the variable called dt underscore work item. Now, like I said, I want to store my work items of only type WI5, right, in the queue. So what I do is I use a filter data table now. So I filter the data table by type equal to WI5, and I keep only those rows. So as simple as that. And now I have a new data table with only the filtered items that are of type WI5. Now I add an if block here to check if the WI5 data rows count is greater than 0. So if you remember, there is an expectation to check if the work items of WI5 type exist or not. Suppose they don't exist, we need to throw a new business exception. So it says no task of WI5 database. Yeah. So in a scenario where we have at least one task of type WI5, we use a for each row data table and we add a queue item. We basically use the add queue item activity to add items to the queue. So it will go one by one and starts adding items to the queue. And here I just wanted to show you what is the data I'm adding here. So here you will see this is current row dot item of WIID, then description and type. So and the variable I am using is RE for REFramework underscore WIID is a work item ID, the description type. So basically it's the column name here that we are using, WIID, description, type. That's what we are getting here. And this data is getting added to the queue one by one. Now, at the end of this process, what you would have, just a minute, let me open the queue item. Right, so let's take any queue. You would have transactions of type new in your queue. And let's go and check the details of one transaction. Right, so like I mentioned here, this is the work item ID, that is the type, what's the status, and what's the description with the date. Right. So in this way, we have successfully added the work items of type only WI5 to the queue. Okay. Right. Let's move on to the next one. All right. So once we add all the items to the queue, you have to remember that in the next stage, we have to process this transaction, right? So our website would, at the end of the initialization phase, would be on the last page here. So we have to make it go back to the first page because that's the point from where the processing will start. So this activity called click one basically clicks the first page and loads it. And so now we are ensuring that for the processing of the transaction to happen, we are in the right state. Our application is in the right state. Okay, so we are doing one more thing. We are also sending a hotkey using Control and T. Control T is the hotkey. We are sending to the plus sign here. So what that would do is, let me show you. So this is basically to open a new tab, and that would open a new tab. And in the next item, we would type the URL for the SHA website. Basically, we would type it here. And this is pretty straightforward. So we are just opening a new tab and we are sending the hotkey again, called enter. And finally, since we want the processing to happen at this page, start from the Acme UI page again, we are again sending a hotkey called control tab. So that would change our application state to the Acme UI part. Okay, so this is about the initialization phase. Next, what would happen is once the initialization phase is successful, it will go to the get transaction data phase. So let's go and see what happens there. Right, here I haven't done anything. So the framework itself is taking care of everything. It gets your transaction data according to the first in first out principle. Right. It's basically very straightforward. So the first in first out principle, your queue name, and this would give you out the first work item ID, work item transaction. Right. So let's say for some reason the initialization something happens. Like we mentioned, there's a system credential issue or the website is down. Then in that case, the framework will throw a system exception and we have to end the process. So that is pretty straightforward. Right. So, but if it's successful, it would get the transaction item. Let's say for some reason there's no data, it will again end the process. But if you are able to get the transaction, we will have a new transaction. And then we have the next state one is process the transaction. Process transaction, we will have to process this transaction. Uh, just give me a minute. Let me close this tab. Okay. Okay, so what's happening here? So this is the process.xaml file. And here, there are a couple of workflows I created for easy reading here. So first is find WI5 work item. So first thing is that as the transaction item is coming, then we find this element of type WI5. So we go through each element. So each row is a UI element and we find only elements of type WI5. Right, that's the first workflow. Then once you have found element of type WI5, then we extract their client information. How do we do that? We go here, we extract through some way, and finally we update the workflow item. How do you do that? So we get the SHA string for the client and update the workflow item, right? Like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, we extract this value, we hyphenate client information, click on hash, get this text, update the work item, add to the comments, click completed, update work item. I'm sorry, just right. And we click on update work item. Yeah, click on OK and close this. Yes. And what you do next is, as you need the state of the application to be in such a way so it can process the next item of type WI5, you go back. So now it comes back to the same page. Now the next transaction comes in and it does the same process that it does for the previous one. Right. So, so if you notice here, I have used an activity known as navigate browser go back. So that's for going back, and it makes the application ready to process the next transaction. Okay, so that is an overall description of the process state. Let's go into it one by one. All right, so first I'm going into the workflow to find the work item. Okay, so this is a, this I found a bit complicated, and I had to try a couple of logic here since I was using the retry scope for the first time. So what we are doing here is, so when the transaction comes in, we try to find the element, like I said. So I believe you would all be familiar with what find element is, but still, let me just give a brief overview about it. So, oops, I think there is an issue with that, but that's okay. We're not running it right now. So, uh, basically, what this find element does is it tries to find elements of type of this work item ID. So it so whatever work items are going to come from the queue are of type WI5, right? Because we already filtered it using the data table activity called filter data table. So this selector that you see here is for this particular column, that is WIID. Now, what's going to happen is going to check this particular column one by one, this particular column one by one until it finds a match. And once it finds a match, so this is the logic I have used. So once it finds the match, it will get what is the row number of that. As this is a table, every row has a number. So it would find the row number of that. And then there is a selector for this icon. It will go and click on that particular row's icon, and rest is very straightforward. So that's the logic I used. Now, in order to find out the work item one by one, we we may not necessarily get the work item ID uh, in the first time it's right. So we need to keep trying it again and again. So for that, I have used retry scope. So let's see the logic of that. So in the retry scope, it will try to first find the element on this column, and if it finds the element, it will assign that element to a variable called out underscore any WIID yearly. I mean, this is any variable. Now, it's checking at the end of every time, every time the retry scope checks for not null. So it checks if this UI element. So this is basically out underscore WIID is an UI element. So it's null at the beginning, and when becomes not null, that means we have successfully identified the work item ID. It will stop processing further. So until we get uh, uh, a work item ID that we want, it will keep checking one by one. Once we get uh, once we get a work item of whatever we desire, so it will stop. So it will keep basically it will keep running until the condition is not met. If the condition is met, that is, this element is not null, it will come out of the loop or come out of the retry scope. Now, one more thing I wanted to add here is I have added one more thing here in the exception. So while we are checking and trying to find our work item ID here, it is not necessary that your work item ID would be on the first page itself, right? So what if it goes to the entire page and is not able to find the element? What should you do next, right? And we know that if the find element after some time, like 20-30 seconds, is not able to find an element, it will throw an exception, right? So here we are using that information here to advance to the next page. So if there is an exception, I would like to go to the next page. So until we find the element, the retry scope will keep on running. So once the element is found, it will come out of that. So that's a I hope you understood this part. It was a bit difficult for me to grab it, but I hope you understood it. All right. So in this workflow, we have found the element. Next, in the next workflow, we are checking if our element so is not null. That is, we have found the row that we are looking for. So if you notice that here the input arguments to the next one are in underscore. So the output of the previous workflow is input here. So we are sending that UI element here. Okay. So here we are checking if the element is not null. Then what do we do? So I have written a regex expression here to get the data. So let's just have a look at that. So basically, I'm trying to get the table row number from the selector of that row. So let's say for this row, I have identified, my bot has identified that element would have a selector, right? And that's my input. And from that selector, I'm getting the row number. And then, like I said, I'm clicking this particular icon. So that's a dynamic selector. So if you see, this is the selector for this icon, and I'm passing a variable called row number. So this will successfully identify the row number, right? So what are we doing next? So once we click that, I mean the bot clicks it, it will come to this page. And next we are using a screen scraping method called getText. And this is pretty straightforward. So let me open that up for you. Right. So this is pretty straightforward. I have added another inner text for the selector with client ID and an asterisk, because everywhere the client ID, client name, and client country are getting repeated. So we are only getting this one, right? So this is pretty straightforward. And in the next projects, we check this regex that I have created. We are getting the data between client ID and client name and client country, and whatever is after client country. So this would basically give me this data and this data and this data. And then I run a loop and add a hyphen to every item that I extract. And finally, there's an extra hyphen, so I remove it. Right. So I hope you're following till now. So next what we do is, so after the initialization phase, like I mentioned, that our SHA1 website will also be open. So we go to the next workflow, and we can use any method. So I have used a basic recorder to switch between the two tabs, because there is a lot of switching that has to happen. So we have to get this data, put it there, get this data, come back here, right? So a lot of switching has to happen. And also because we know that basic recorder is basically a full recorder, right? It will have the parent selector also. So if we look at this, it has even the tab information. So this tab would know what's the next tab, what's the adjacent tab. So that's basically I use the basic recorder. So that's the Acme system 1 hour tab, and the nearby tab on the right is SJ1. So that's why I use the basic recorder to switch between the type. And so this will basically click the tab named SHA1 online, because we want to extract this data and put it over there. Like I said, we type into that, we click hash, we get this text. So this is just for demonstration purpose, not the actual data I'm putting here. Right. So we get this text. We, we go back to the tab, click Page tab again, click the button on Update Work Item. Right, that's what we did. And click uh, click the status, click Add to the comments, click the button Update Work Item, whatever that I explained. So this will do that. Right. And then what I notice is that sometimes when we update the work item, I try to click OK, but for some reason that didn't work. So I had to send a hotkey. So I clicked, I sent enter, and that did the job. And then I close it. Right. So that takes care of my one transaction, like I mentioned. Now, what's next? What's the last thing we need to do here? Right, go back. Right, so so this would basically set up the app again for the next transaction to be processed. So so I have provided a brief description of the code and the different activities, workflows that I have used and how everything works. So next we can see a demo of this. Okay, so let's start the demo now. So before we start our demo, we will create a queue. Right, so we created a new queue here. Let me just copy paste that. And add the queue name. Excuse me, in the config sheet. So we have our queue name and the queue folder, but this is not mandatory like I told you. Okay, let's save it. And let's close all the other tabs. Okay, right. So I'm going to start the bot in the debug mode and with the fastest mode and highlight elements. Right, so let's get into it. Okay, so it's reading the settings file. This might take some time. Let's try to get maximum. So next it's going to open a couple of processes like kill all process if you want to kill some processes before you want to open your applications. And now we see that it's going to invoke the login workflow file. Right, it's detected the UI element of login. Going to get the credentials from the asset. Okay, so we have the dashboard. Okay, it's detected the dashboard element. Now it's come to the work items. And now it's going to extract the table data. It's detected the work items and it's highlighted the table. And now it's going to keep clicking the page after page. Okay, so we are on the last page now, and soon the bot would start adding items to the queue. Once that's done, let's see what's happening in the background. So you see it's adding items to the queue. Okay, so it's detected and sent a new tab hotkey and open the new website and then a control tab and reset it back to the first page. Next, we can expect the framework to retrieve the first transaction item, and we don't need to actually scroll down, but let's just check whether we have any items of type WI5 on the first page. So we do not have it. Let's see how the framework responds to that. It's taking some time. Okay, looks like the framework didn't find anything on the first page, and see, it's identified the first work item, and now it's going through the regex, trying to find out the row number, and then it would click the icon. Right, you see, it's identified that. Now uh, it's extracting the client information basically. Okay, this is unusual. Let's see what's happening in the background. Okay, it's trying to get the text, but for some reason, oh, I'm sorry. I think I put the breakpoint there. It's my bad. Right. So let's continue there. Okay, so it's extracted the client information. It's going back there. First tab at the comments. Yeah, it's clicked on the work item. Right, so that's the first transaction item. So now it has to go back. Yes, it's went back. So you guys can skip the video and no need to wait if you don't want to see the entire debugging. So it's taking the time because it's getting the transaction item again. So that would be the next work item ID, the third row. Okay. Okay, looks like it's identified. Okay, so looks like we are finally done with all the transactions. So we did see a small error at the end, but I think it's like minor error, nothing big. So let's just check what happened. So if you check the logs, we see that uh, that all the transactions coming in and transactions ended successfully. Let's see how many transactions were processed. Okay, so the final number we say is 13. So 13 transactions were processed, and in the end, there was no transaction data. And because we ran it in the debug mode, it took so much time. So, uh, so we can say that we were able to successfully process the all the transactions. Right. Now let's go ahead and check the status of these work items. Let me go back and come again. Okay, so there's nothing here on the first page. Okay, so here you can see that the transactions of type WI5 is completed. So on this page, everything looks completed. Yes, and also just to verify whether the work item was updated, let's go and check one of the work items. Right, you see this hash code, this security hash that's added. Right, and the status is completed. Now let's check the status of every page. Okay, so there's one item here that's completed. Everything looks good on this page as well. Right, this is good. This is good as well. And 8, page number 8 also is good. Right, and page number 9. And let's see, is there anything on the last page? Yes, there are a couple of items. Oh, not a couple, just one. Status completed. And let's check whether this has the comments. Right. So we are able to successfully complete and update all the work items with the hash security hash. Right. So that's pretty good news. And one more thing, let's go ahead and check our queue. What is the status of the transactions? So we go to view transactions. Right, you see the first page, all the transactions are successful, and the same goes for the last page. And in total, there are 13 transactions, and this matches with our final transactions number. Right. So at the end of this exercise, we are able to successfully, using RE frameworks and the queues, complete this practice exercise, and uh, and finally we can also see how do we submit this exercise. Right, so let's go to our course. Okay, so what you would need to do is you need to upload your assignment here and make sure that until your evaluation is completed, and your evaluation will be done by the bot itself. You do not reset your test data. So your evaluation will be done by the bot with this test data that's here currently that you last run. So that's it from my side. I hope you guys will like the video, and do subscribe my channel. Also, let me know in the comment box whether something has to be explained more, or something you didn't understand, or you want more information or any kind of help you need. Well, thank you very much.